Wish a very good morning to all of you, and we're very grateful to see you here. Let me add my words of welcome to all of you, especially if you're visiting with us today. You've honored us by your presence, and we're grateful for that. It's certainly our hope, our prayer that you'll enjoy being here this morning. We want that to happen. We want you to feel comfortable and find this to be an enjoyable place for you to come. But more than that, we hope that you'll be built up in the most holy faith by your presence here this morning. You've heard the reading that Brother Matt read in your hearing this morning from the book of Galatians, and the context of that really isn't completely clear from the reading that we heard this morning. So I want to talk about that just a little bit to help understand the situation that Paul was addressing. He was writing to the churches in Galatia at a time of what appears to be a lot of conflict. And if you go back just immediately preceding those verses that were read in our hearing this morning, you can see that very clearly. Part of those conflicts had to do with the Jews trying to impose the old law on the newly converted Christians, and all of the conflict that had come about because of that. And you'll remember that just right before he made the statements in our reading this morning, he made the statement you're familiar with about cautioning people about biting and devouring one another. That was said in this same context. So it's pretty clear there was a lot of conflict going on. It's not too hard to see that. So they were living in that kind of world. And I don't know about you, but I feel like we're living in that kind of world too. There's conflict, it seems like, on every corner. I almost can't get out in a public setting without seeing it. And certainly we see it when we watch the news or anything that reports on what's going on around us. We see the conflict and all the turmoil that's going on, not for the same reason that they experienced, but certainly the effects are the same. I saw a person this morning when I was driving to church. I saw a person that was angry in their car about something that somebody had done. I could see from the gestures and the look on their face, they were not happy. This is the world that we live in. And so it's easy for us to start focusing on all the problems out there, all those conflicts and disputes and so forth that people engage in around us. And that's not what Paul was talking about. Paul turned that inward. He caused them to look at themselves. And so the title of our lesson this morning is The War Within, because that's the one that's important. The conflict within you and me, that's the one that matters the most. All of this other stuff that goes on around us, a lot of it is just so much noise. But the conflict within ourselves matters, and how we deal with that matters. And so I want to talk to you about what Paul wrote about this sort of thing to the Galatian churches. And I think it'll have as much meaning for us today as it did for them back then. So let's get started with our lesson this morning, the war within. Paul started out this discussion that we're going to talk about this morning, and he's explained a couple of concepts there that maybe you probably have heard about, maybe you completely understand those, but let's talk about those a little bit, because these concepts really are at the heart of what we want to discuss. He talked about the concepts of the works of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit. Those are very important ideas, ones that we should understand. So he introduces those concepts in the first few verses of the reading that you heard this morning, actually verses 16 through 18. He introduced those, and he said there's a war that goes on inside every person. So every single one of us this morning shares in that. Every one of us has got a war going on within us. And he explained what was at stake in that war, why this war matters to us. And he explained how this war can be won, how it is that we can be victorious in this war within that we're going to talk about. So let's look in the first few verses that I mentioned, the introduction that he gives, and let's see what he said about that. He introduces the concept of walking in the Spirit, or a few verses down, he says it this way, led by the Spirit. I think those essentially mean the same thing. What do those mean? What is that? That's important that we understand it. If we don't get that, if we don't understand what that means, we're not going to understand what Paul was teaching, and we're not going to understand how it applies to our life. So let's talk about that just a little bit. There's probably a lot of places that we could go and try to figure out what that means. I could give you Dale's definition, but Paul wrote those words. Let's let Paul define those words. In Romans chapter 8 and verse 5, I think he provides a good description of what those terms mean. He says, "For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. But those who live according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit." That's a pretty good definition, isn't it? It helps us to understand what it was that Paul was saying. He is telling us that walking in the Spirit, that phrase that he used, or being led by the Spirit, is about where we set our minds. Where is our heart? What matters to us? What do we value? Where are our minds? That is what's important, and that's what determines whether we're led by the Spirit or not. Our spiritual checkbook doesn't lie. And what does that mean? Let me see if I can explain that. I read something that somebody else wrote about this, and it said that if you want to know what someone values, what's important in their life, look at their checkbook. Now, I don't know how many of you actually use a checkbook the way people used to. Some of you do, and some probably don't. But somewhere there's a record of how you spend your money, regardless of whether it's a checkbook or not. He said if you look at a person's checkbook, you can tell what's important to them because you'll see where they spent their money. And things people spend their money on are generally the things they value, the things that are most important to them. I think I would agree with that assessment. I've spent a lot of years of my life, and in fact I still do, looking into the bank accounts of other people. And a lot of times, most of the time, I don't even know the people whose bank account I'm looking at. I may know something about them, but I have no personal relationship with them at all. And so as I look at their bank account, I can tell exactly what kind of people they are. I can see what they spend their money on, and I can tell from that what things take precedent in their life. I can tell where their mind is because I can see where they spend their money. And when we look at our spiritual checkbook, we can see the same thing. Each of us has one of those. Where is our focus? Where is our mind? That's our spiritual checkbook. And when we look at that, it doesn't lie about what we value in life. Where is our mind? What is our mindset? We can look at our spiritual checkbook and find that out. Every one of us can do that on our own. We don't have to ask each other to look. We can do that for ourselves. He introduces a second concept after he talked about walking in the Spirit. He talked about fulfilling the lust of the flesh. And so that's just the opposite of walking in the Spirit. That's walking in the flesh. And that's what he's talking about there. So you have two conflicting concepts there that are mentioned in this introduction. We can walk in the Spirit, or we can walk in the flesh. That's the two choices that we have. That's the only choices that we have. We can value and have our mind on the spiritual, or we can value and have our mind on the carnal, and there's nothing in between those two things. Now here's a valid question that we probably should ask is, we all struggle with this. Can these things coexist in our lives? Can we have kind of a sort of a spiritual mindset and at the same time have a little bit of a carnal mindset too? Is that possible? Well, Paul answers that question for us right in the very next scripture. He says, the flesh lusts against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary to one another. There is that conflict, and they're contrary to one another. The mindset of the flesh and the Spirit does not go together. So those two sets are incompatible. Those two desires that are within all of us, every one of us has those. Those are not compatible. We can't entertain both. A lot of times people want to do that, and they end up being very miserable. The most miserable Christians that I know are the ones who try to have one foot in the carnal and one foot in the spiritual. Have you ever been caught between people who are having a really heated dispute between themselves? You ever gotten in the middle of something like that? Maybe a couple of your friends that were having a dispute over something, and you ended up getting drug into it for whatever reason, and you felt like you were in the middle because you liked both of them? That's being caught between two warring factions, and that's what's on the screen. That's what happens when we try to have one foot in the carnal and one foot in the spiritual. We're torn between those, and it makes us unhappy. When we satisfy the flesh, our spiritual side's unhappy. And when we satisfy our spiritual side, the flesh is unhappy. And so it's a prescription for complete unhappiness and ineffectiveness as a Christian to try to live in both worlds. And Paul makes it clear that's not possible. So then what is the answer? What should we do? How should we handle this? Well, Paul answered that too in writing to the Ephesians in a different letter, but still an answer to the question we're talking about, and he discusses it in the terms of putting on garments. And this is the way he's phrased it here. He says, put on, concerning your former conduct, the old man which let me back up. Put off, concerning your former conduct, the old man which grows corrupt according to the deceitful lusts, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind. You notice what he says there? It's in your mind that you need renewal, in the spirit of what you think, where your values are, where you place your emphasis, where you write your spiritual checks. That's what he's telling them. And that you put on the new man. Put off the old and put on the new. That's what he says the answer is. He didn't say leave the old man on or leave a little bit of the old man on, but he says get rid of those old garments and put on the new ones. That's the answer. That's how you serve. That's how you serve the Spirit. That's how you're led by the Spirit. So trying to appease both our carnal mind and our spiritual mind, he says, is like putting on new clothes over old, dirty ones. And none of us would do that. We know better than that, and he understood that too. So that's the reason he phrased it the way he did. So we must face the reality that we all have in our lives. We're either walking by the Spirit or we're walking by the flesh. One of those is leading us. One of those walks controls the decisions that we make in life. It controls our spiritual checkbook, if you will. Our decisions that we make then rule our lives. That's how that works. And isn't that the point of the last part of chapter 5 and verse 17 that we just read? He says, these are contrary to one another, so that you do not do the things that you wish. That's what he was trying to get across. So here's the points that Paul has made so far. He says we're in a war within ourselves, not on the outside, but in ourselves. He says the war pits the spiritual against the carnal. He said the war can be won. It's not hopeless. There is a victory to be had. The victory depends on being spiritually minded, not carnally minded. And the coexistence of those two things is impossible. That cannot happen and have victory for us at the same time. So now let's look at the outcomes of this war that we're talking about, this war within. What does it produce? Well, he starts in verse 19. He says, the works of the flesh are evident. The works of the flesh are evident. The works of the flesh are things we can see. They're observable. We know what they are. They're evident. You can look about and you can see what the works of the flesh are. And he goes on to describe what those are. He said they're adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, envies, murder, drunkenness, revelries, and the like. when I read that, I start kind of thinking, okay, let me get my spiritual checkbook out here. Do I find myself living in that kind of life? And of course, I try to quickly go to those things and say, I didn't kill anybody. That's for sure. I know I didn't do that. And, well, I haven't committed adultery. No, I'm not guilty of that. And then I start looking at some of those others, and I think, have I ever had an outburst of anger? Yeah, I've probably done that. Have I ever been envious? Probably so, And so then I can find myself in there, and I start to question whether is this what my life is about, or were these just mistakes that I made on a one-time basis? And that's important to remember. He's talking about here a lifestyle. These are things that people are given over to, not a mistake that somebody made and then corrected and did better. He's talking about this is what people write their spiritual checks for. And I want you to pay attention to the last 3 words that he wrote. He says, and the like. Man, that covers a lot. When you start looking at all those things he listed, and then he says, and anything like that, and you go, oh, wait a minute. Do I find myself in that? Do I find myself maybe not doing those things, but something like that, something that's similar to that? Have I been guilty of that? A young man approached me one time, and he had been involved in using illegal drugs. And he said, there's no scripture that says not to use illegal drugs. So I don't think God has condemned that. And I thought immediately of these scriptures, and there's others like this in the New Testament, and it mentions drunkenness. Is that like using illegal drugs? I'd say it's exactly like it almost. So that's what Paul's doing. He's not trying to give an exhaustive list of every conceivable work of the flesh. He's saying these kind of things are evident, and there's a lot more just like them that are evident as well. These are the works of the flesh, he said, that are evident in the lives of people whose minds are given to the carnal, people who put their value in the carnal things of life. So the question that we have to ask is, as we go about our lives and we are filling out our spiritual checkbook, are we filling it out with stuff that's listed there or like the stuff that's listed there? And again, I'm not saying did we ever make a mistake and do one of the things that might be on that list or like that list, but is this what our life is about? Is this the kind of life we've devoted ourselves to? Are these our walk or our practice? That's what the real issue is. Is this the way we walk? Is this how we live? Is this our practice of living in life or not? And that helps to define whether we're carnally minded or spiritually minded. And Paul says there's a consequence to this. He said, if you're going to live this way, if you're going to walk in the flesh, if that's what your walk is going to be about, he basically has said you've forfeited your relationship with God. That's what's happened. If you're going to live for the carnal, if your mindset is on the carnal, then you have forfeited your relationship with God. That's a scary prospect, and it's one that we ought to all consider as we think about where our values are. Then he shifts gears in verse 22, and he starts talking about what he describes as the fruit of the Spirit. And he says that is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. There is a law against all those works of the flesh that he mentioned, but he says these things, there's no law against all of this. The fruit of the Spirit is something God wants. He does not legislate against it, but rather encourages it. So what did he mean when he talked about the term the works of the flesh, and then he talked about the fruit of the Spirit? Interesting way that he put that, and let's see if we can figure out what he meant by that, and I'll give you my understanding. The works of the flesh are the behaviors that are, as Paul said, they're evident in the lives of people who are carnally minded. That's what the works of the flesh are. They're behaviors that are driven and caused by fleshly desires of humans that we all have within us. So all of us are capable of this. Every human being has these things in them. So the works of the flesh, however, do not equal the fruit of the flesh. Those are two different things. And hang with me on this. I'm going to explain what I mean by that. But the works of the flesh that he talks about are not the same thing as the fruit of the flesh. The works of the flesh do produce fruit, that's for sure. The works of the flesh have fruit. But those works and the fruit they produce are different things. And you're going to see what I mean as we go on just a little bit further. Now about the fruit of the Spirit. Let's see if we can understand what he was talking about on that. That's the things that are produced in the lives of those who are spiritually minded. Those whose mindset is on the spiritual rather than the carnal. The actions that produce this fruit are, as he called it, the works of the Spirit, are performed by the Spirit in those who are spiritually minded. The Spirit does that. It performs the work that produces the fruit of the Spirit. So there is a work of the Spirit that produces the fruit of the Spirit, just like there's a work of the flesh that produces fruit of the flesh. So again, though, the work of the Spirit is not the same as the fruit of the Spirit. Those are two different things. Hang with me, we'll get there. The works of the Spirit are are what the Spirit does to bring about a changed heart and a spiritual mindset. That's the work of the Spirit. That's what the Spirit does that produces the fruit of the Spirit. So if the works of the flesh are not the same as the fruit of the flesh, then what is the fruit of the flesh? Does the work of the flesh produce a fruit? And as I said, yes, it does. Paul said these things are evident. So what are these? What is the fruit that's produced by these evident behaviors of the carnally minded? I would say that in very simple terms, the fruit of the flesh is the exact opposite of the fruit of the Spirit. So if you look at what the fruit of the Spirit is, if you want to know what the fruit of the flesh, in other words, what does the work of the flesh actually produce, the exact opposite of the fruit of the Spirit. So let's see if we can kind of summarize this and make this hopefully make more sense. Listed in that left-hand column is the fruit of the Spirit that we read about just a moment ago. In the right-hand column is what I'm calling the fruit of the flesh. These are the things brought about by the works of the flesh that Paul said are evident. So if you look down the list of the fruit of the Spirit, you see that it's love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, and so on. But look down the list of the fruit of the flesh. Instead of love, the flesh produces hate and indifference. Instead of joy, it produces despair. Instead of peace, it produces anxiety. Instead of patience, it produces impatience. Instead of kindness, it produces rudeness. Instead of goodness, it produces evil. Instead of faithfulness, it produces unreliability. Instead of gentleness, it produces harshness. Instead of self-controlled, it produces an undisciplined life. The exact opposite of the fruit of the Spirit. Which one of those things do you want in your life? Which column suits you better? Do you want the fruit of the Spirit, or do you want the fruit of the flesh? Because what your mindset is determines which one of those will be present in your life. I was reading some things about joy in people's lives and how people confuse joy and happiness. Happiness and joy are not the same things. You can be joyful in times when you're not happy with your circumstances. That's entirely possible. Do you want joy in your life, even in difficult circumstances, even when things are hard, even when things aren't going like you want them to? Produce that with a spiritual mindset. That's how you have joy in those times. If your mindset is carnal, instead of joy, when things are bad, you'll have despair. You'll be ready to give up. So the things in the right-hand column are produced by that carnal mindset that we've talked about in comparison with the spiritual mindset that Paul is encouraging. So another question that's a valid one to ask: can we have the fruit of the Spirit by just adding them to our lives one by one? Can we do that? Is that possible? I don't think Paul's focus here was to tell us just to be more loving or to be more kind or to be more patient or to be more joyful. Yes, he would encourage us to have that sort of thing in our life, but the point that Paul was making was not go try to add these things to our lives one thing at a time. I don't think that's even possible. What Paul was trying to get across and what he was trying to get us to learn is to learn how to walk by the Spirit. And if we do that, those things will naturally come about. We won't be trying to add them one thing at a time. The fruit of the Spirit all those things are so intertwined that I think it's impossible that we can add them one by one. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Would it be possible to have kindness and not have love? Would that be a possible thing? Seems to me like it might be a very difficult thing to do. Would it be possible to have patience and not have self-control? It seems like those things go hand in hand, doesn't it? And you can go down that list and you can find a thing that goes with every one of them that you would have to have before you could add that into your life. And so that's why I say that Paul was not trying to tell them, look, you folks need to learn to just quit fighting and biting and devouring each other and be more loving. That's not what he was saying. Although he wanted them to be more loving, what he was actually trying to get across was change your mindset. Have a spiritual rather than a carnal mind, and that'll take care of itself. You won't be having conflict if you have a spiritual mindset, because that'll take care of the problem. Now, you might be thinking, well, all I have to do then is just wait on the Spirit to work in my life. There's nothing for me to do. I just sit here and wait for it to happen. Is that how it works? Do we just wait and let the Spirit dump out on us the fruit of the Spirit? Well, of course not. That is not the answer. If we read on in the same reading that we have previously been discussing, Paul said, "And those who are Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires." That's our part of this. Get rid of those things. Eliminate those from our lives. Eliminate the carnal thinking. That's what Paul is calling us to do. So walking in the Spirit involves a daily decision and a daily effort to crucify the flesh, to keep from living the fleshly life that we're all inclined to because we're human beings. If we seek to live in the Spirit, Paul says, our daily walk should be consistent with that. If that's where we desire to be, then our walk ought to be headed in that direction. And I want to wrap up what I'm saying this morning by sharing a story with you that some of you may have heard this or read it somewhere. This is certainly not original with me, but it resonates with me, and I think it makes the point of what we've been talking about this morning. So I want to share it with you. resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego. That's one of the wolves that he sees within himself. What does that sound like to you? Sounds like the fruit of the flesh to me. It sounds like that's exactly what he's describing. He continued, the other wolf, that is good. He is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith. That's the other conflicting wolf that's in his life. Sounds like the fruit of the Spirit, doesn't it? Sounds like he's describing what the fruit of the Spirit produces. He says the same fight is going on inside you. And I would say that to everybody who's here today. The same fight is indeed going on in you. The grandson thought about it for a minute and then asked his grandfather, which wolf will win? Which one of those wolves, those two that you've described that's inside you, which one of those is going to win? The old man simply replied, the one you feed. The one you feed. That's true of the spiritual man and the carnal man, the spiritual mindset and the carnal mindset. The one you feed is the one that's going to win. If we feed the carnal, we'll get the carnal, and we'll get the fruits of it. If we feed the spiritual, we'll get the spiritual, and we'll get the fruits of that. So we need to be aware of that as we live our lives every day. These are decisions that we have to make. There's a choice about this. So I want to encourage you this morning, let's feed our spiritual walk, and let's starve our carnal walk to death. I hope that's the thought you take from this today, and I hope our talk has been interesting to you this morning and has meant something to you. It certainly did to me as I studied it, and I hope I've brought it in such a way that it made sense to you as well. We don't want to close this morning without offering an invitation to anyone here this morning that might need our assistance in baptism, or perhaps you need our prayers this morning. We would be glad to assist you in either way. If you've been struggling with the carnal man inside, today is the day to get started fixing that problem, and we're ready to help you do that. If there's someone who needs our help in either way, won't you come forward while we stand and sing?